Hello, everyone. Welcome to the November Zebra Technologies Dev Talk. My name is Dan Qualiana. I'm the head of developer relations here at Zebra, and I'm really excited about today's topic. We have Robin West, one of our solution architects, who's going to be walking through the newly updated best practices guide on integrating Zebra printers. This is something that we've had some documentation in the past, but she worked closely with the team here, and they've made a lot of new enhancements to that, really defining how best to work with our printers, how to do the development and the testing. But before we dive into that, I wanted to remind everyone that we do have our developer portal at developer.zebra.com. And on that portal, you can find all sorts of updates. We have some new posts about using Android Studio 3.0 with the EMDK, some updates on the crack attack and fixes that we have for our Android devices and our printers, and even how best to deploy those down to your devices. So please visit that portal. We also have a developer events section, and on that section you can see upcoming webinars, events, workshops, things that we're doing. Next month, we will be talking about the new LinkOS C#.NET SDK for Windows. We also have been hosting a whole bunch of workshops across Europe and the Middle East. So if you're interested in those, look at some of the posts there to see what's available. And you can even see a post I did about DroidCon London and San Francisco, some of the presentations we did on Android security. So, again, thank you very much for joining. And now I'd like to turn it over to Robin.
Thanks, Dan. So we're talking today about best practices for doing printing applications. And part of what we want to talk about was why it is that we actually are talking about best practices. We found over the years the team here has done tests on hundreds, if not probably well over 1,000 different apps across all different operating systems and all different situations. And the focus of this testing has been primarily just verifying that yes, it does work with the printer. But again and again, the team that's doing the testing has found the same types of issues come up. Apps crashing when you go to print, failure to print, or it doesn't print exactly what you're wanting it to print, and then just performance issues. So the best practices was originally actually designed to help sort of share some of the knowledge that was built around what was done in testing here, and share some of our testing practices, so that before you guys send it to us, or before anyone sends it to us to do that testing, or before you send it out to your customers, it's been tested to the point where these common issues aren't coming up anymore. But this time around, when we're kind of looking at it, we also realized that there's some further guidance that we give based on the testing and the different interactions we've had with developers over the years. Just common performance and those types of things, but also just how to create a better user experience for your customers from the standpoint of the whole printing portion of that user experience is, if printing is part of your application, should be considered part of that user experience is how that printing is happening, how quickly they have to, how long they have to wait for it, what it looks like, all that types of thing. And then just how to best utilize some of the value-added features that Zebra has within our product line. Some of the things that have changed since the last time we published the best practices, the original ones were focused really on how we recommend to test to these best practices, which is good. But we realized that we really needed to add more depth and more knowledge around how do developers initially actually develop the code to actually create these best practices and be following these best practices from the initial coding standpoint. And then just over the years, we developed a little bit more depth to the best practices and more use cases that that we can cover with them. And again, as I mentioned, part of it was just broadening the audience. We're not just, targeting testers for this, but software developers, user experience engineers, and the initial group that was focused on was the Zebra partners who were looking to validate. So broadening that audience to include the developers and other test engineers, and really trying to make this a document that anyone writing applications for Zebra printers can use and get some benefit out of. And then within the document, which I'll be pulling up in just a moment, we do have sort of a structure of the best practice, of the best practices, sort of the best practice name, description, and then 2 primary sections within there is how to actually develop for it, how to do it, and then how to test for it. So I'll show you that in just a moment, but wanted to go over those things. So in order to find the best practices document, there's a couple of different ways to do it. Probably the easiest is when you're in the developer portal, developer.zebra.com. This is the main welcome screen that you see. Go into the printing or any of the printing pages, and then under helpful links here, there is a link for the best practices and FAQ, which brings you here. Obviously, this document is housed on TechDocs, so if you're familiar with TechDocs, you can find it on here as well under the LinkOS product line. But it's pretty easy to find as far as either from TechDocs or from the developer portal. So this list, obviously we already had a published version of the best practices out there. This is what we're calling 2.1 for our new version of it. And I've already gone through primarily the purpose, who should use it, and how the document is organized. But I wanted to dig into actually what some of these best practices are. Another thing to note is that within this document, you'll see a little icon here and there throughout it. These are essentially things that if you were to come to Zebra for a validated, to get your app validated by Zebra, these are the things that you really want to make sure that you are following and are part of your application. So this little yellowish icon, you'll see a couple of different spots that we're going to recommend that you definitely do for validation, because that's one of the things that we really test for. So first thing first is out-of-box behavior. The big portion of what this means is that when you get a printer out of the box, brand new, out of the box, will it work with the application that you're writing or testing with? And this, we see that the reason for this particular best practice was because we found that a lot of developers will get a printer, either their own printer, or will get it from somewhere, and we'll set it up to whatever specifications they want it to be set up for, and they'll write their app and it'll work with that particular printer. But when it goes out into the field to their customers, the customers may not have their printer set up the exact same way as the developer, or if they come to us for validation, we default the printers so that it is in a clear state before using the applications. And we're finding issues came up because that wasn't taken into account. And because not all of our printers actually have the same default behaviors. So some of our printers, as an example, some of our printers are 2-inch, 3-inch, and 4-inch. If you're writing a application that is specifically designed for a 4-inch printer, for 4-inch wide labels, what are you doing about the fact that somebody could potentially use your application in a 2-inch printer? Are you handling that? So these are some of the things that we wanted to make note of. So a couple of the main points we have as far as things that you should be looking out for when you're talking about out-of-box behavior are making sure that you're setting up the right connectivity options for your end users. Our printers have a lot of different connectivity options, and not all the printers actually have the same connectivity options. A mobile printer is more likely to have Bluetooth as a potential option, and usually pretty much all of our printers have USB, but some of them can do Wi-Fi, some of them can do Ethernet, and not all of them will do all of those different options. So making sure that you're setting it up properly for that pretty useful. The other major thing that we see is that not all printers have the same default page description language. So there's a couple of different options as far as that goes, and making sure that that's important. We'll go into a little more depth. Other things are things like print speed, darkness, label width, label length, those kinds of things. And you'll notice in here there's a couple of the red word code in a lot of these different sections. And if you click on that, you'll get a little drop down here showing some code for how to do that. The code in this document is essentially Android Java code, but as mentioned, all of these best practices can essentially be done in pretty much any operating system, any development platform, for pretty much all of our printers. So just because the code in this particular document is assuming Android Java doesn't mean that the best practices that that if you're concerned about specific practices, you can't do them for a Windows application or an iOS application, or something written with some cross-platform tool that we don't actually support directly. Pretty much all of these things are supportable within your code if you have some basic knowledge of how to actually do basic communication with the printer. And if you have questions on that stuff, you can certainly ask it on the developer portal. We also have a lot of sample code on GitHub, and most of it actually does follow the core of these best practices. So you can take a look there on GitHub as well to find the sample code that we've got available for a lot of the different operating systems. And like I said, many of them follow the best practices that we are, at least the core of the best practices that we're showing in this guide. So these are a couple of the different settings that you could potentially set and some different ways to set them. And some of the other things to look out for are if you want to help your customers out with remote management, you can set those up within your application. Different special features like ZBI, virtual devices, that sort of thing. Virtual devices are our way of doing emulating competitive product. And then a lot of times you'll actually want to check the firmware version of the printer because there might be different features that you want to take advantage of that are only available in specific firmware versions or versions of LinkOS within the printer. So you can actually verify that as well. And then just basically verifying that the best practices across the entire document here are being met as well is part of just out-of-box behavior, making sure that that's all good. Testing it, there's generally speaking, get a new printer or default the printer that you've got, and then test to the best practices throughout this document. And I have a one really basic method for defaulting a printer. There are a lot of different ways to default Zebra printers, and different printers sometimes have different options for that, but this is the more, this is one of the easiest and most flexible one across most of the Zebra printer lines, to be able to default the printer back to its factory settings. The other thing to keep in mind when you're doing this is taking a look at a couple of different printers and trying to test to them. A QLN may not behave the same way as an IMZ printer. So taking a look at some of those behaviors is useful to do while you're doing this. Stability. So this is one of the biggest issues we actually see when we're testing code, is that when somebody actually goes to do a print, the app will crash or it will freeze. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. Primarily, if the printer becomes unreachable for some reason, either it loses the connection, goes out of range, for something that's like a Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, or it just powers down. If you're not actually doing certain things in your code, you're going to get these types of issues. So one of the primary things is making sure that you are running on a separate thread, separate task. The other one is to make sure that you're always doing everything in a try-catch finally block, which seems common sense, but we run into a lot of developments and apps out there that, because they're not doing this, it'll crash when you go to print. So that's not something that you want your users to have to deal with. So just making sure you have this basic stuff in there. One of the newer things is that when you're doing a connection close now, you also want to have a try catch around that, because a connection close can also throw certain connection assumptions. So just making sure that that's handled as well is one of the newer things that we've added in there. And then basically testing is pretty simple. Just while you're running the app, just turning off the printer at random times, making sure that the app is actually handling that, and verifying that it's not going to crash or hang, and notifying the user that that there might be some sort of a connection issue. Security. This is a new section in here. We've found that security is a common concern across developers and other people who are using our products. And the sort of common sense answer here is that you are connecting to a printer, especially if you're connecting to the printer over a wireless type of connection like Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. It is an open connection, and potentially people who are into bad things can try to utilize that. So some of the just more common sense things to do about it are just making sure that if you're not using a certain type of connection, that you turn them off. They are open by default, almost all of the different connection types. So turning off options that you're not going to use it can be pretty important to do, especially in a critical environment. As a use case, I talked with a large software company a little while back, and they were writing an application for e-citations. So basically, people, police officers who are writing up citations for people they pulled over on the street and wanted to do in their app, and then print off a receipt for that citation to give to the person they pulled over. And they were doing this app, and we were talking to them about it. And sure enough, it turns out that the type of connection that they were trying to do to the printer was an insecure Bluetooth connection. If you can imagine sort of the thought process here, if you've got an insecure Bluetooth connection to that printer, literally anyone who can, pull up alongside that police officer and essentially print off their own citations, or perhaps even modify that citation at some point to print off something else. So that was just considered, just a really bad idea to do. But these guys hadn't really thought about that because, they don't really think about the fact that a Bluetooth connection is potentially an open connection. So that's just one example of why security is important. But there are a number of other things with Bluetooth or Wi-Fi that could potentially be an issue. So just making sure that you're using the best security levels for your particular application is important. The other thing is when you're actually sending things to the printer, generally speaking, if you're just doing basic printing tasks and you're sending the entire label to the printer each time you want to print, the printer doesn't store that information at all, but there are certain types of ways of storing information in the printer. Say you're printing an image, you're printing your entire label as an image, or you have a stored format that you want to have in there. Just make sure that if you're doing those types of printing applications, that the data that you're sending to the printer, because those things are stored, don't have personal information in them. This is especially important for the healthcare industry, but it could be important for other types of things like e-citation, where personal information might be part of the image or stored format, and you just have to be careful that you're not doing that as much as possible, and that if you do that, that you delete the stored format or image as soon as you can from the printer. So as far as how to test it, there are a couple of different things. There's a bunch of different SGD commands to turn on and off the different security, the different communication settings, and then there's a couple of different commands to try and get the different files out of the printer. Most of the files that are considered to be security types of files like passwords, certificates, those types of things are stored in such a way that it's pretty much impossible to get them out of the printer. But like I said, there are different types of things that you could potentially be storing on the printer in different methods that you're going to want to verify don't have personal information in them when you're doing the testing. Formatted output. This is basically our look at when a customer gets a printout. Does it look nice? Does it look proper? Does it look nice? Does it have the information that they want to have on there? And does it have the is it readable from both the human perspective and from the perspective of a barcode reader? So a couple of things to look at from this perspective are just using ZPL whenever possible, and there's a couple of different reasons for that, which I'll go into a little bit further on, but there's a good reason for wanting to be able to using a page description language rather than an image to do printing and get the nicest possible output. Especially when you're dealing with barcodes, if your label has a barcode on it and the entire label is being sent to the printer as an image, the process that both your application goes through and the printer goes through in order to create that label with that barcode, you're almost always going to get a loss of quality when you're dealing with that barcode, because a barcode is should be a very precise type of product. When you're doing those different types of conversions from an image down to the printer, and this, you get lost fidelity both when you're converting an image within your app, depending, no matter really what system you're using to do that conversion, but also when it gets down to the printer has to be able to handle that properly as well, and just it's designed to handle barcodes as barcodes, not necessarily as images. So when you're dealing with barcodes and have them as part of your image, you really want to keep that down to a minimum because there is going to be a loss of quality there. Some of the other things that we have to help you out with that are label design tools. There's a number of different tools out there. We have our own free tool, but we have a number of partners who also have design tools that are really, really helpful to be able to create really good high fidelity label formats and help you with getting your printer set up with all of those formats properly, so that you can potentially take that format, put it into your application, and use it throughout your application. The other thing is when you're talking about the actual paper stock, label stock, media is what we can kind of call it around here. You have to be kind of picky about which type you use. We tend to recommend Zebra certified supplies, and there's a number of reasons for that, primarily around the fact that we've tested it and we've ensured the highest quality on those supplies. But we know that not everyone actually does use Zebra certified supplies. So just making sure that as you're going through and working with your customers, that you're working with the same media they're working with, and that you've verified that that it's going to print out in an acceptable manner on that particular media. And if not, you can contact us and we'll help you figure out the right media to use for that particular application. The other things to look at are the setup utility and just making sure that all the different setup is done right. Testing, this is a little bit more qualitative as far as what's considered acceptable print quality. You have to kind of work with your customer to figure out what makes sense for that. There are ways to do barcode essentially grading, but it does require some specific tool sets to be able to do that, barcode verifiers. If you have one, hey, great, use it. We recommend barcodes should always grade out to be a B or higher. If you don't have one, we can work with you on it. to at least help make sure that the barcodes are scannable, even if even if we can't, based on the situation, grade them for you. So I'm going to take a pause here. Dan, do we have any questions that came in so far?
Not yet, Robin. No questions. A reminder for those, if you do have questions, enter them into the question box and submit them, and we can review them through with Robin that way.
Okay, thanks, Dan. The next one on this list is what we call page description language. This one is one of the issues this is part of one of the issues we see come up that's fairly regular, where a developer is writing an application and either portions of their label don't print or the entire label doesn't print. On specific printers, a lot of times it'll print fine on one printer, but it won't print on the other printer. Issues like that come up, or essentially the other thing that comes up is that the actual data that you're sending to the printer will print rather than what you want it to print. So a lot of that has to do with what we call the page description language, and there's a number of them out there. ZPL is the one that we tend to recommend because it's a language that Zebra is continuously improving and working on as far as adding new features and functionality to. It's also the language that has really good font and localization capabilities. So if you're writing an application that is working in the Middle East and you get a broader audience and you want to take it to Europe, with ZPL you could potentially actually do that a lot easier than you could with some of the other page description languages out there that we support. And then the last one is sort of a practical one that ZPL is pretty much shipped on every printer that we make right now, other than the card printers. So, regardless, you might have to do a little setup on the different printers in order to utilize ZPL. It's going to work, for your customers, whether they're using a QLN, an IMZ, or a ZD500. It'll work across pretty much all of the different printers. Couple of different pieces that I wanted to show in here were there's two parts to actually setting up the correct page description language. And in this particular sample code, it's assuming ZPL. But first one is to actually set up the page description language that the SDK is going to use. You do definitely want to, when in your code, the main way to do this is when you're actually creating the Zebra printer object. And you definitely want to actually set the language that you intend to use when you're using this method to create the Zebra printer object. And pretty much all of our SDKs have this concept of the Zebra printer object and set them up the same way. So there is a way to set up the Zebra printer with just a connection and don't tell it what language to use. And the printer factory will attempt to go out and figure out what language to use. Not only does this method make certain assumptions that you might not want, but it might just choose a language that you're not actually expecting or wanting to use within the printer. So setting that language when you're using this factory instance or this Zebra printer factory is really kind of important, and it's not something that you might be thinking about when you're creating your application. The other piece is to actually set the language within the printer. So just because the SDK is set to use a certain language, and that's primarily for things like image conversion and font conversion and format conversion or format handling, but actually setting it within the printer as well. When you're setting it in the SDK, it doesn't necessarily mean that the printer is set up properly either. So the code in here actually shows you how to set up the page description language within the printer using the SGD command set. So both setting the page description language to, in this instance, ZPL, and then making sure that it has been set to that language, because not all printers actually do have ZPL. A lot of them do, but not all of them. So just verifying that that has been set properly as well. Again, this is primarily for a tester, a way that they can actually verify the print language has been set properly as well. And a note to test it on different printer models that you intend to support. So again, talking about the whole fact that the default behavior on different printers may not be the same, especially when you're talking about the page description languages involved. The next one on here is a common thing that we talk about when we're talking about best practices for printing, and that's just status. That means that when you are actually going to do some printing, you verify that the printer is in a good state to print. Because if you send the print job to the printer and it's not going to in a good state to print, your users will, will not see printing and will be like, okay, I use the app, why is it not printing? And, they end up futzing with the printer and, getting frustrated with the whole situation. So doing certain things just to verify that the printer is in a good state beforehand. And in fact, afterwards can be pretty useful from the user experience perspective and limiting that amount of frustration. It can also help to build out that user experience so that you can help them fix the issues as well. So things that might cause the printer not to print are, if somebody didn't, if the paper ran out, or if somebody didn't close the paper, the media door, the paper door properly after they, refilled the paper, the printer is out of range, or if different things like ribbons, you can actually put the printer into like a paused mode as well. So there's a number of different things that could potentially go wrong when you're printing. So there's some basic code for showing how to get the current status of the printer, and however you want to display that particular issue we'll go into later, but just having the ability to figure out what the actual issue is. And then the other thing that we tend to recommend now is that you also actually do a check for the printer status during and after print. And there's the primary loop for doing that is checking the number of formats in the receive buffer, which is kind of one of our ways of verifying, okay, is it still printing or not? And then, is it ready to print? Because printer still says it's ready to print even if it's currently printing, which in this instance is a good thing. The printer will buffer up if you send multiple print jobs. The printer will buffer them up for you, and we'll put it into that receive buffer. So as it goes through and as you send labels to that receive buffer, you can kind of go through and check and make sure everything's still good during that process. So if it runs out of paper in the middle of your print process, you could potentially offer to reprint or to do other things to help your end user with that. There is also what's called an alert system within the printer. This is more useful for if you've got an always-on connection, things like the web link connections where it's the printer's always connected to the system, or TCP a lot of times, a type of connection where it's always connected into that system. And you want to know immediately if there is a problem with the printer. It's a pretty easy setup where you can just send a couple of commands to the printer, and at any time after that point, if the printer runs out of paper, it'll basically send out an alert notice to you over any number of different connections to tell you about that particular issue, and it tells you actually when that issue's been cleared. So a little bit different use case, but can be useful depending on what your situation is. We tend to recommend that that if the printer does go into some sort of an error state, that you wait and don't send more print jobs until all those errors have been cleared. There are certain use cases where that may not be the right way to do it, but there is a buffer within the printer to collect print jobs, but at some point it is going to fill up. And there's an error to check for that as well, but at some point that buffer is going to fill up, and you're going to want to make sure that that's all being handled properly. So we tend to recommend just when you start to get an error, don't bother to send the print job. Wait till the errors have been cleared and then send that. Reprinting is always a useful thing. Newly released with Android and PC, I believe, right now, you can actually set up what's called a status channel. So the printers are capable of, over network connections or Bluetooth connections, not USB, but network or Bluetooth, being able to open up we call a secondary channel, a status channel. And that's basically when you send commands to that particular channel, they can only be specific types of commands, but things like checking status and checking different settings you can do over that status channel. And it does respond quicker than if you're doing it over the primary main printing channel. So it makes it a little bit more, speeds up the process for being able to do that. And there's a number of different reasons for that, but it's essentially on network, it's on a different port, and on Bluetooth, they set it up as a secondary channel so that you can get status either while printing or at different times depending on your situation. But it also speeds up the performance of actually doing that status check as well. So if you're finding status checking is a little on the slow side, you can use the status channel to do that a little bit quicker. And then one of the other things that has come up more recently has been if you really want to verify that the printer has actually printed off your label, for a number of different circumstances, either your app has crashed or some other types of reasons where you have to really verify that the printer has printed at least something, and we can't verify that it's printed the correct thing, I'm going to be honest here, but we can verify that it's printed something. It's fed something out. That we can do with what's called the odometers. We have some code for checking the odometers as well, and verifying that basically checking the count for the number of labels that have been printed, and that directly reads off of the motors within the printer. So if the motors haven't run, nothing's been sent through the printer, nothing's actually been printed. So we know that if the motors haven't run, it hasn't actually been printed, regardless of the different status issues that might be going on. So the other one that we have that's really related to the status is actually displaying the status. We recommend that if you do detect a status problem within the printer, that you display that to your user, that you let them know in readable terms what the issue is going on, so they don't have to look at the printer to find out what happened. Even if your application is handling everything, and even if the printer itself does have a nice display menu on it to show what the error is, you still want people to be focused on your app. You don't want them to be focused on the printer. This is I'm talking to a printer person. You want them to be focused on your app, because that's where they're getting your user experience and your richness of experience there. Performance, this is kind of a new one, and this one's a sort of more open type of best practice. Biggest thing to keep in mind here is that keep in mind the performance of your application and its interactions with the printer. There's a couple things you can do to provide better performance within that, and these are kind of going through those. Testing is a little bit more iffy, just because we don't have set standards as far as a lot of these performance variables, but these are some things to look at to help improve your performance of printing. So some of the things that you can actually modify are the print quality itself, and again, going back up to the page description language stuff as far as the print quality. especially when you're talking about RFID encoding or things like slow connections like BTLE connections. You really want to keep in mind the amount of data that you're sending to the printer and keep that to a minimum. So if your primary print mechanism is printing out images, an image is a far larger data stream than a ZPL code for the same particular printout. So keeping that in mind, if you're having issues with just time to print types of issues, that's something that you really want to look at as far as things to do to improve that, is to cut down the amount of data that you're sending to the printer by using images. And in fact, if you can, storing images or even storing the full format as a stored format onto the printer, and then only sending essentially the variable data within each print job is another way to really cut down on the amount of data you're sending to the printer each time you print. Not so much of an issue anymore with a lot of the connections, but we're finding things like the BTLE or RFID encoding, which are slow to begin with for a number of different reasons, that you still have to kind of keep that in mind as far as the amount of data that you're sending as far as the part of the print job. Some of the printers now have sleep mode on them, especially some of the newer mobile printers, and using that to save on battery life can be useful, but understanding that is also useful to know what that means as far as how to turn it on and off and the battery life for that. Using the status channel for checking status, and then some of the other things you can do is using NFC, which we have in most of our printers now, to do pairing. And if you're using virtual devices, just making sure that they're running within the printer as well. And then we've got some information here on checking the battery life and making sure that it's in a good state. We find a lot of our customers are actually using batteries long past their what we consider even poor health as far as how long the battery itself should be used. And this goes towards how long the printer can, or how long the battery will actually last, and how long the printer will run before it shuts down. A lot of times, if it's in that poor state, it'll run for maybe 30 seconds and then shut down, and then the next time they want to print, they've got to power it back on again. And we find customers actually will do this rather than replacing the battery. So that's just something to keep in mind if your customers are having those types of issues, that the batteries do have a usable lifespan, and that you can recommend that maybe it's time to switch it out. And this is one of the things you can do to check and make sure the battery is in that state. And then the last actual best practice is around branding. If you're going to use Zebra branding within your application, there are certain guidelines that we have for being able to do that. If you are planning on publishing, we definitely recommend that you go ahead and email our brand team to verify that it's been done properly. If you are validating with us, we will verify it ourselves, but it's one of the things that we recommend for you guys to do, that if you're going to be using our branding within your application. The last section that we've got in here is around what we call FAQs. So looking at the best practices, we started off with what are things that we can help you improve on, but then we kind of looked at it from a different perspective, and this came from one of our newer developers on the team. Said, these best practices are good, but if I don't know what is wrong, it might be helpful to have it from a different perspective. So we looked at it from a couple of different perspectives, as far as what to do if you run into your app is crashing, or what to do if your printer is not printing exactly what you expected to print, or what to do if your printing is just taking a long time to print. So that's where we came up with this FAQ section. And we plan on building out this as we go through and find more common issues that the developers run into when they're writing apps for printing. So a lot of these same things are in the sections above. So things like if you think the app is crashing because you're talking to the printer, do the try catch statements. Make sure you're running on a separate thread. So the same things we talked about above, but taken from the perspective of if this is what's happening, these are some things to check on. If you're concerned that the print jobs weren't actually printed, if like it crashed at some point during the app and you're not sure that it happened correctly and you really have to be sure, these are some things to do to verify that. If it doesn't print what you want it to, these are some things to verify. Again, these are all the same practices as above and the same snippets of information as above, but taken from the perspective of, okay, if it doesn't print, these are some things to verify. And then taking a long time to print, there's some other things to take a look at. One thing to note on here is we're aware that some applications are relatively, they don't print a lot. So if you just start printing off a receipt, once every 5 minutes or so, a lot of the code we have in here is pretty useful because it's showing just basic open, close types of connection types of pieces of code. But if you're dealing with a situation where you're printing a lot of labels in a batch type of situation, or just printing, quite often, some of the code we have in here would have to be modified in order to work for those particular circumstances. So keeping in mind the fact that you don't have to close the connection after each print if you're printing a large batch of print jobs at one time, and all the different use cases around batch type printing, and we can go into that. One of the things that we're probably going to add into this is talking about how to handle batch printing as a separate use case, because it is some of the things you have to do are a little bit different for that. And then let us know on the portal if you have some suggestions, and I spelled that wrong, on how to improve the document. So this is a continuous improvement type of thing. As we have different use cases come in, and as we see different things that developers might want to know about, we want to add that to this particular document and make sure that it's got the best possible best practices that we can make to recommend for developers to use. So, Dan, do we have any questions?
We did have a question come in around ZPL. So as you are building out your labels, what is the best way to test that as you're creating the label?
Okay, there's a couple of different things. As you're creating out the label, if you're using a design tool, a lot of times they'll show you a sort of a GUI interface for that, and that works fine. But it doesn't necessarily tell you, how it's actually going to look when it's printed. If you don't want to actually use the printer to do all of that printing and make small modifications and print, there is one thing that you can do that's a little bit you might not think about. And I'm sorry, I'm starting up the printer here so I can show you. If you've got a printer and you just don't want to have to waste all that paper printing off a bunch of different things and testing different modifications to your ZPL and your label, there is a way to handle it. Basically, you can throw the printer onto a network, and a lot of the printers will actually go onto a network. But even if it's a mobile printer, we have some base stations that you can put them on to Ethernet connect them or Wi-Fi. And this is the printer I've got sitting right next to me, the IP address of it, and I do index.html. I'm attempting to connect to the printer web page, and essentially this is a web page that's hosted on the printer itself. And I'll show you a little trick in here. I'm hoping it'll pull it up.
I do know, Robin, this is an area that you did cover in a previous DevTalk. So
Yeah.
some folks can go on Zebra's YouTube channel. There's a DevTalk playlist when there's one about building ZPL and building your
Yeah.
labels, and there's also a link to the slides on the developer portal.
Yeah, so essentially what I'm doing is I'm trying to go to the printer webpage. It's not pulling it up very well, but and if you go into the section on the file management, within there you can create a new label file, or you can open up a stored format within there. But if you create a new label file, it'll pull up a nice little box, and you can drag and drop your ZPL into it and preview it. And that gives you a really nice preview of essentially the actual bitmap that the printer would print if it were going to print it. This is basically one of the only ways we can actually virtualize the ZPL print jobs. It only does work with ZPL, but it is a nice way of being able to verify that the printouts are going to work the way that you expect them to before actually sending to the printer and wasting the paper on it, especially if you're making minor tweaks to your formats. It's a great way of just doing some quick testing on it, just to verify that the tweaks that you're making are going to work. So I'm going to pull that up. Yeah, that's not very useful. Okay. So do we have any other questions?
No, those were the main questions that had come through so far. I mean, I would say one other question I have, and I know you're busy right now, but if you could just kind of remind people where they can find this best practices document.
Sure. Best practices document is on TechDocs, but you can find it really easily by going to developer.zebra.com. And hitting the printing page. And on the side here, there's some helpful links, and best practices is right up here at the top. It will also be modified in the menu pretty soon, but it's not fixed in there quite yet. But right now it's under the helpful links on the printing pages, and all three printer pages have this link. And that'll take you straight to the best practices for printing. If you're on TechDocs under LinkOS, you can either find the link right here, or if you take a look, we can pull up the best practices from there. So there's a couple of different ways to get at it, either from Developer Portal or from TechDocs.
Great. Thank you, Robin. This was a really great overview, and I think this is really going to help a lot of our print developers. So appreciate you putting this document together and running through it with us.
Thank you.